It is a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who is both an alumnus and a former faculty member in our department. Jeff Cody was a senior project specialist in the Buildings and Sites Department at the Getty Conservation Institute in Los Angeles from 2004 until his retirement in early 2022. Trained as a historic preservation planner and an architectural historian, he got his PhD here in 1989. Jeff taught in the graduate program in historic preservation here from 1989 to 94, and in the architecture department of the Chinese University of Hong Kong from 1995 to 2004. In addition to New Buildings in Old Cities, writings by Gustavo Giovannoni on architectural and urban conservation, co-edited with Stephen Semmes and Francisco Siravo, and several peer-reviewed journal articles. Jeff's publications include Building in China, Henry K. Murphy's Adaptive Architecture, Exporting American Architecture, 1870 to 2000, and 3 co-edited volumes, Chinese Architecture and the Beaux-Arts, Brush and Shutter, Early Photography in China, and Historic Cities, Issues in Urban Conservation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeff Cody.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for that gracious introduction, and I'm truly pleased to be back here at Cornell. My life really changed as a result of the years that I spent here, and it's quite emotional and wonderful to be back here again, where I now live. And I thank all of you for making this physical trip to this auditorium in such gnarly weather, and for being patient with the power outage. And for those of you on Zoom, thank you for joining. I'm going to begin with some, I'm afraid, more grief reminders of the scale of the challenges facing all of us regarding urban reconstruction, urban redevelopment, or what we sometimes call heritage conservation in the field that I've been very close to for many years. As we're all aware, the world is being racked by tremendous warfare right now, leading to the destruction of many, many cities. We don't have to enumerate too many of them, but just as a reminder of the scale of challenges facing us when hopefully these wars come to an end. We're also facing problems having to do with what I call in one of my books maldevelopment, having to do with really poor decision-making the world over by planners, by architects, by politicians about what to do with historic fabric. You're looking here at a situation currently going on in Ethiopia with the destruction of a very large historic neighborhood for the sake of building new roads, the standard answer to urban renewal or by urban renewal in many parts of the world. Here's another example of that. Here's another example of the kind of maldevelopment that I'm calling it. I'm not going to go into great detail of why I'm calling it this, but this is a situation in the part of the world that I did a lot of work in Southeast Asia, where new development and older historic fabric sometimes have a very hard time coexisting. We're also very aware of the dramatic changes and challenges posed by climate change in terms of urban redevelopment and urban change. Here, just a reminder from this terrible tragedy that happened last year in Maui. So the questions become, it seems to me, how and what to reconstruct, and how and what can we as planners or architects do to repair, repurpose, or otherwise conserve important links to the past? Where can we turn for inspiration in light of all of this tremendous destruction? Well, personally, I was inspired by the words and ideas of this wonderful young Syrian architect, Maro al-Sabuni, who was a young architect from Homs, this city that has been destroyed, really, who lived through the horrific bombing of her city. And she asked herself whether rebuilding the city on a blank slate would be a, quote, interesting challenge. And this is what she answered. She said, "It shouldn't be done from scratch. Architecture should hold the values, the aesthetic values, the moral values of the place. Architecture should contribute to the life of the people. It should be responsible for their spiritual, social, and psychological needs, not only the practical needs. The place, even if it's destroyed, the place has a memory, and it's not just in the stones. But architecture takes you to places. It takes you even with the details. Each detail has a value to hold and a suggestion to make. It should hold the memory of what was important for people in the place." I think that's really inspiring. But where else can we turn for inspiration? Well, obviously, this college is one such place. It's been nearly 30 years since I taught here, but I'm confident that even with all the changes that have happened in these decades, Milstein Hall was just a fanciful dream when I was here in the late 20th century. There are still, I'm sure, inspiring instructors, projects, and examples here at Cornell that will help you as students to become better problem solvers. I certainly hope so. Today, I'm hoping to inspire you by sharing ideas about, although I'm not going to give you specific prescriptions or instructions, about designing or otherwise accommodating new building in old cities, from a long-forgotten Italian conservation architect, Gustavo Giovannoni. And much of what I'm going to talk about is from this book, which I'll be happy to share with you in the aftertalk. So what I want to do is to begin to tell you a little bit about this very curious person. So let's linger on these words for a moment that I'm just going to leave up here as I begin to tell you about this fascinating man. Giovannoni was almost certainly the leading figure in the Italian architecture scene during the first half of the 20th century, and his legacy lives on, although often anonymously, in part because he opposed several solutions proposed by those imbued with modernism. At a time after World War I, when what came to be called the modern movement was gathering steam as a dominant architectural ideology. It became a dominant architectural ideology right here in Sibley, thanks to the major work of phenomenal architects, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, and so on. But despite the Bauhaus and other manifestations of this ideology, many Italian architects at the time were wary about whether to jump on board. And Giovannoni was one such architect. He was more drawn to the ideas about urbanism from Camillo Zitta, Patrick Geddes, Charles Boules, and many other so-called traditionalists around the early 20th century. Giovannoni's voluminous writings anticipated the revival of traditional architecture and urbanism, the growing importance of conservation, and the need for buildings that are resilient and sustainable over the long term. Many of his insights, especially in urban design and heritage conservation, have entered the mainstream of preservation thinking, but hardly anyone today can identify their source. And while his traditionalist contemporaries in Britain or the United States are fairly well known, Sir Edwin Lutyens, Auguste Perret, Paul Cray, John Russell Pope, Bernard Maybeck, etc., just to name a few people in architectural history, Giovannoni fell into obscurity. I'll tell you why in a minute. After the Second World War in France and Italy and Germany especially, those architects who resisted the modern movement were largely erased from the architectural histories of the 20th century. In the 1990s, Italian scholars, though, began to look with greater impartiality at those who had been neglected, and a richer and more complex picture has begun to emerge, and this book is part of that movement. Giovannoni's professional and academic ideal personal and academic ideal was what he called the architetto integrale, or the complete architect, one prepared to practice architecture, urbanism, and restoration, and teach them to the following generations. What a great idea, huh? Here we are in a college with planning and architecture and restoration and preservation. There's the potential for that here. Giovannoni himself fulfilled this description, producing skillful designs for new buildings, new additions, and infill buildings in historic places. He made master plans for both historic urban centers and new towns. He was involved with restoration of historic structures, scores of studies in architectural history across all periods, and he founded the School of Architecture at the University of Rome, La Sapienza, where he taught for a half century, training generations of noted Italian architects. And when I learned about this curious figure only a decade ago, and I found out that none of his work had been translated into English, it was amazing to me. I decided, as I was working at the Getty, that this would be a time to edit a book about this man. And so I collaborated with two wonderful architectural practitioners and educators, Steve Semmes from the University of Notre Dame, and Francesco Saravo, who works for the Aga Khan Historic Cities program. After several years of work together, the book finally came out last summer, and Giovannoni's work and ideas can now be shared, as I'm doing this today, with you because of having this English translation of a lot of his work. His work and ideas imply several lessons for sustainable urban design, even if Giovannoni himself probably never contemplated the scale of our own urban challenges today. So why this book and why now? So this is really the crux of what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm going to leave this on so you can absorb it a little bit before I go into detail about it. This is the essence of it, in other words. This would be, when I told my daughter that I was going to do this, or my son, he said, oh, you should make a TikTok video of this, you know? And I thought, well, yeah, this is kind of the TikTok video version of my talk. But I'm far too analog for making a TikTok video and showing it to you, so I'm not going to do that. But I'm going to be returning to these key points again, and this is mainly what I want you to remember from this talk today, these 4 lessons. And so I'm going to ask you to reflect on this long gone, now obscure character that I just began to introduce to you, and his approaches to the myriad issues raised by old cities. Giovannoni developed those ideas in Rome, where he was born and spent his entire professional life. I'm just kind of curious, how many of you have been to Rome? Can you just raise your hands? Wow, a lot. Good. Wonderful. However, in what follows, I want you to try to imagine the Rome, not the Rome that you know, but the Rome of 100 years ago, when the automobile's popularity and the city's exploding population posed enormous challenges. Can you imagine that there were serious proposals to erect highways through the Piazza Navona and the Colosseum? It was really true. I mean, that's truly a gladiator contest. Can you imagine Rome in severe neglect, not the manicured, over-restored area it is today? And even though many of you haven't been to Rome, you've spent time in some other old city. And now I'm going to do something a little bit different. 现在我用国语欢迎好多学生从中国来的学生参加这个讲课。但是一个问题关于这个题目是在中国里面关于历史文化城市的建筑保护有没有跟 Giovannoni 一些例证？所以为了帮我忙，我讲话的时候，我请你们想一想一个中国城市的地区，比如说一个例子。讲课以后呢，我会问你们共有 大家这个例子好不好？我感谢你们的合作，谢谢。So what I was just saying and asking, because I'm aware that many Chinese people are here, was that as I summarize some of Giovannoni's ideas, I'd like you to think about an example of either urban conservation or urban destruction which resonates with you from Giovannoni's approach and methodology. I just asked our Chinese colleagues to consider Chinese examples, but please let your urban-focused minds wander to consider other cases too. At the end of the talk, when I'll take questions, of course, I'll ask for your responses. So thanks for considering this as you learn more about Giovannoni. So whether you're from China or elsewhere, here in Ithaca, we all live in an old city. Let's see if I can, there we go. So as I re-engage with Ithaca after being away for so long, I'm reminded of Giovannoni a lot as I go around town. Sometimes I try to relate his ideas to places close to us. So I'm going to make some frank personal judgments that you might or might not agree with, relating some of what I'm going to talk about Giovannoni to our local context. But first, why was Giovannoni devalued and ignored after his death in 1947? His work was disregarded and his name suppressed in architectural circles for what was deemed political reasons by most people. His detractors claimed that he had collaborated with the fascist regime, a claim that, while strictly true to some extent, could also be made against almost all of his critics. Architects and university professors were, for the most part, aligned with the regime until the mid-1930s, and designers of all stylistic persuasions cultivated the favor of Mussolini until the fall of the regime in 1943. Politics was clearly not the decisive factor in Giovannoni's fall from grace, though. The true reason was, as I said a minute ago, he had been a vocal opponent of the modern movement. However, as I note in this slide on the lower right, he was not universally opposed to modernism. Those of you who've been to Florence and come into the train station at Florence, major modernist building that Giovannoni thought was wonderful as part of being near Florence. So he wasn't ideologically completely opposed to modernism, but he saw modernist urbanism as an existential threat to the conservation and expansion of historic cities. This was not an idle concern, given that Le Corbusier had a particular attitude toward the center of Paris. You see it here on the left, bottom left, in the Plan Voisin in 1925. And so at the same time that there was a growing movement for historic preservation, as we call it, or heritage conservation, there was also this growing movement of the modern movement. And I'm just going to read for you just one brief paragraph from the beginning of our book that sort of explains something about the importance of Giovannoni's thinking. What makes Giovannoni's thinking timely is the convergence of his ideas on urban conservation with emerging approaches to the design of new buildings and cities. This convergence can help us overcome the current separation between the new and old, as well as resolve the environmental and climatic challenges we face today. Giovannoni's notion of the architetto integrale, the complete architect, can further the idea of a multidisciplinary figure capable of advancing an integrated vision of the city in all its spatial and temporal dimensions. His writings, taken together, comprise a veritable treatise, perhaps more relevant to our time than to his, on how to conserve and how to build anew to advance ideals of beauty, sustainability, and social justice. So, what did he actually say? Well, the book is organized into 6 parts around 6 of the key themes that he was involved with for most of his life. And what we decided to use was to do in the book was to use the Italian terms, some of which he himself created as a term, to organize the book. So here are the first 3 of these terms. and you can read this, and I'm going to say a bit more about each of these in a minute. Our intention in the book is to return Giovannoni to a larger international context. In addition to a series of interpretive essays, it includes 30 excerpts from his writings on a range of subjects and from throughout his career. The book is organized around these 6 themes, as I said, and so I want you to begin to understand what he was about through these terms, and which I'll delve into a bit more deeply in a minute. So the first 3 are those. Here are the other 3, restauro, innesto, and ricostruzione. So let's delve a little more deeply into this. Edilizia. Edilizia in Italian is sometimes translated as ordinary building, what we might call vernacular architecture. Edilizia in Italian also refers to the activity of building and the product, so it's both the process and the product. The ordinary construction, mostly houses, that make up the private realm of many historic cities worldwide. Giovannoni drew the important distinction between monuments and fabric, and pointed out that monuments derive their meaning from the fabric, which is why preserving the surroundings of landmarks was so important to him. He declared that an entire city could be considered a monument. This shift of attention from individual landmark buildings to urban districts, whole towns, and landscapes was part of a consistent urban focus to Giovannoni's thought. No historic building could be considered simply as a lone freestanding monument without recognizing its relationship to the city or landscape that surrounds it and lends it meaning. Another aspect of edilizia was a focus on the more informal kinds of building one finds in historic cities, what he called architettura minore, or what we would call vernacular architecture. He directed much of his energy to opposing the demolition of medieval quarters in Rome and elsewhere for the sake of creating out-of-scale and inappropriate large open spaces around monumental buildings, a tendency that originated in 19th century Paris, when a huge plaza, or parvis as it's called in French, was created in front of Notre Dame Cathedral in place of the smaller scale buildings that formerly framed views of that cathedral. Giovannoni argued for the preservation of the pedestrian-scaled, variegated neighborhoods within which the larger monuments traditionally were situated, composing a picturesque urban scene, as in his beloved Rome. This greater value placed on ordinary urban fabric is the basis for our historic districts and conservation areas. Here, I'm just showing you one example of this in our contemporary world in New York City with the Washington Square Park and the Arch, where these townhouses that you see on the left, hidden behind those trees, these very expensive townhouses, provide this kind of dialogue, let's call it, between the monument and the urban fabric that gives it greater meaning. And here's a local example. The aerial view on the left is a wonderful model by David Fogel of Ithaca's West End as it existed in the 1950s, before extensive urban renewal, what Italians call sventramenti, and what we also know as tabula rasa, or a blank slate, recalling Marwa al-Sabuni, that Syrian architect's words. On the right are the detached late 19th century and early 20th century residential building stock that we see all over Ithaca that comprises much of this wonderful old city, now our temporary home. The second theme is ambientismo, from the Italian word ambiente, or environment. It is close to our contextualism, referring to the physical context of any historic site, but it's really much more correctly a respect for the setting. For Giovannoni, the historic building, the historic city, was a living organism, and he coined the term ambientismo to denote an attitude of respect for the city as it has developed through time, accumulating layers of history and creating a reciprocal relationship between architecture and urbanism. Additions to buildings or new urban neighborhoods, he wrote, must approach the historic city with modesty and respect, seeking continuity of character rather than visual disruption. Here you can get a fleeting sense of that variation within a frame of continuity in Brussels on the left, or in Venice on the bottom in the middle, or in Rome on the right. I'm just showing you some reminders of what is meant by this notion of respect for the context. So now I come back to the first two of my takeaways that I want you to take from this lecture. So these are the first two. Through direct observation, understanding fully the local place, a building and its physical setting within, again, this social context. Because to Giovannoni, it was very important to pay attention to people and the people living in these places, not just the buildings. He loved Rome. He loved Rome's neighborhoods. And he felt that the challenge of the early 20th century in his lifetime was the destruction of those neighborhoods and the displacement of all those people. Very common concerns to what we have today. He also believed it was very important to understand these, what he called the permanent causes, the lasting influences of how place was merged with culture and how this place and culture reflected a particular local identity. So, in other words, he urged his architectural students to work from the detail to the larger macro context. So, I'm circling back here just to emphasize these points to you. And here you see another example in Ithaca on the right of this notion of paying attention to the continuity of culture. This is, by the way, a project of Ithaca Neighborhood Housing Services, established in 1976. And I've been very pleased as I get around Ithaca to see several examples of their work, which I find quite impressive. However, there are some other examples in Ithaca which, you're seeing another INHS project here on the left, the North Side project that's just coming to fruition right now after many years of changes in the West End, in the north side of downtown Ithaca. But you can also see on the right what I consider to be pretty disastrous, horrendous examples of what some people locally have decided to place in our environment. Returning to Ithaca after many years, I really have been astounded, frankly, by some of the urban projects that have come to fruition, such as the new convention center. And amazingly to me, this poor Masonic temple down on Cayuga Street is still vacant, thanks to Jason Fain, exemplifying several missed opportunities for what Giovannoni would call a respect of the setting. There's a sage comment, I think, by the historian of the American landscape, J.B. Jackson, that encapsulates Giovannoni's concept of ambientismo. He said, in order to change a place, you must first love it, because if you try to change it without loving it, you will ruin it. I think that's a very important lesson to think about, and Giovannoni would have applauded that. He loved Rome, and he loved the changes that he was proposing to keep that continuity of culture. Let's move on to the third part, what's called diradamento, a third central theme to Giovannoni's conservation approach, what sometimes would be considered a thinning out of urban fabric. Like so many of his metaphors, this one derives from the pruning and thinning out of an orchard or a forest, carefully tending it, removing invasive growth, trimming the branches to let in the sun. He does this by making incremental changes, removing non-conforming structures, opening up a view or a little piazza, allowing the district to breathe, while also changing or adding just a little bit. Diradamento is a character-conserving process that avoids both an uncritical preservation that would freeze or prevent all change, and a permissive development that would significantly alter the historic character of the place. His theory was first implemented in plans for the quarter around the ancient Roman street Via dei Coronari that you see on the left. This is one of his drawings, where the surgical removal, almost like a dentist, of a handful of non-conforming buildings allowed exposing the impressive side wall of an important Baroque church and the creation of new piazze. A decade later, Vittorio Mariani, a follower of Giovannoni, realized a redevelopment of the Salicotto district in Siena. You see this on the right, based on Giovannoni's ideals. The result was a mix of restored medieval buildings and new ones designed to be stylistically and typologically similar to the historic structures, together shaping a more salubrious neighborhood. Further experiments in diradamento were undertaken in Italian cities like Bari, Bergamo, and Assisi, with Giovannoni as collaborator or mentor. But conservation of the center of Bologna in the 1970s, that you see here on the left, is the best known. People from all over Europe, architects from all over Europe in the 70s were going to Bologna to take a look at this example. Here, the communist local government temporarily relocated the residents of the deteriorated historic center, rehabilitated the housing block by block, and then avoided gentrification by offering upgraded houses to the people who had lived there before. Some streets were lined with new houses that followed the historic typologies of the neighborhood. Writing a century ago, Giovannoni declared that the problems of the slums can best be addressed by relieving overcrowding, improving hygiene, reinforcing education, and providing dignified work for the residents, not by the wrecking ball and replacement with developments like the devastating Pruitt-Igoe project that you see on the right that was finally demolished. Here in Ithaca, more examples. As I drive along Route 13 fairly often, the busiest thoroughfare in Ithaca, I ask myself, whatever happened to this notion of diradamento here? It seems to be more often an approach of tabula rasa. So I ask myself, whatever happened to edilizia? Two additional takeaways. Again, this is a reminder of what I want you to think about leaving today. Here, this selective replacement of expired urban fabric, this diradamento, instead of the sventramenti, the urban renewal approach of a tabula rasa. In other words, accentuating this continuity of culture. And finally, conceiving the city not as a mere collection of buildings, but instead as a living cultural organism and as a work of art, which needs sensitive, careful treatment, often not accomplished, unfortunately. The fourth theme we discuss in the book is restauro, or restoration. Giovannoni developed a comprehensive theory of restoration, proposing treatments ranging from pure conservation to major rebuilding with new material. He sought a middle way between the strict, hands-off conservation approach of John Ruskin and the stylistic restoration of Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc. Giovannoni identified the early 19th century restoration of the Arch of Titus in Rome, in the Roman Forum by Giuseppe Valadier, as a model for restoration that makes the monument whole, but also avoids confusing the historic parts with the restoration itself. And I'm hoping you can perceive here in these views, only from these two images, but how here Valadier added new elements. I'm going to use, let's see if I can do this. So here you see the state of the arch as it was before Valadier, and then what he did was this is the old fabric here, but this is all new. in the 19th century. The new forms appear simplified and in a slightly different material. Roman travertine rather than marble, new moldings that do not have carved ornament, and the columns without fluting. At first glance, one sees the entire arch. On second glance, one sees the distinction between the original and restored material. The difference is subtle, but clear. Giovannoni promoted this approach, which decades later would find its way into post-war international conservation guidelines, including the U.S. Secretary of Interior's standards for restoration. I'm sure Giovannoni would applaud what is perhaps the largest restoration project in the country now, the remarkable transformation of the former Michigan Central Station into a new innovative campus of the Ford Motor Company in Detroit. A grand example of the civic monuments that once adorned most American cities in the early decades of the 20th century. The station had decayed to the point it resembled the ruins of a Roman bath after the fall of the empire, complete with trees growing out of the crumbling walls and vaults. The transformation is cleverly revealed in this rendering. The former station and the office building are once again a point of pride for the city. Here in Ithaca, we're beginning to witness, perhaps, the major transformation of the Emerson Chain District on South Hill. As some of you might know, there is now a fair amount of controversy about this, concerning tax abatements as well as other issues. But this major restoration project will potentially alter Ithaca's future in ways we can't really imagine, but we'll have to wait to experience. As I mentioned earlier about the Masonic Temple, Ithaca has mixed results with restoration. Enough said. Part 5 of the book has to do with innesto. The heart of Giovannoni's approach to the relationship between new and old architecture in a conservation setting is best expressed, maybe, by this term innesto. It comes from the verb in Italian innestare, which means to graft, which can be defined as a horticultural technique whereby tissues of plants are joined so as to continue their growth together. Substitute architectural for horticultural and buildings for plants, and we have an architectural technique whereby tissues of buildings are joined so as to continue their growth together. Giovannoni here offers another striking botanical image in which an addition to an old house or the extension of a city is like grafting a branch of one tree onto another to create a single new plant. The analogy recognizes the need for change and to introduce new elements into a historic setting, but also prioritizes continuity of character at architectural and urban scales with a minimum of contrast. Thus, the keeping of facades only and building some high-rise behind it, what one of the key professors in this department, Michael Tomlin, used to call façadomy, is something that Giovannoni would certainly not applaud. Current conservation norms are often interpreted to require this contrast in urban scales. But Giovannoni offers a dissenting view in which cities grow organically as living organisms, continuing their growth together. Frankly, Giovannoni would be appalled by the building that we're now in, by the grafting of Milstein onto Sibley, since OMA was clearly not very interested in what Giovannoni called the continuity of character. Much could be said, and has been said, about this behemoth structure that's enveloping us now, and I'm just going to leave it at that. Giovannoni designed several modest additions to buildings in and around Rome in which he demonstrated his concept of innesto. His little building linking the medieval Casa dei Crescenzi that you see here on the right, the actual original medieval building was this, does not imitate the original building, but while being deferential to the historic building, introduces a new style and new forms that are easily identified as additions. So these are the additions to the original medieval building. Giovannoni argued that only deference and respect, or love, as J.B. Jackson said, for the buildings already there can inform a truly compatible alteration or addition. Giovannoni's position is echoed by the ICOMOS Valletta Principles of 2011, which specifically warn against excessive contrast between historic and new elements and call for continuity of composition in the urban setting, something that didn't happen here. The language of recent UNESCO documents on historic urban landscapes suggests the relevance of grafting as a model for navigating a non-confrontational relation between new and old architecture. Here's a more encouraging example here in Ithaca, at least from Giovannoni's perspective, where at the corner of Cayuga and Seneca Streets, we see on the left the former DeWitt School building, repurposed as Moosewood Restaurant and series of residential areas and up above and some commercial spaces below, and has a complement, I was pleased to see, in these Breckenridge Place apartments right across the street, which also is right across the street, as some of you know, from that poor Masonic temple. We arrive at the highly contested issue of reconstruction, which has sparked lively debates in Europe regarding rebuilt heritage buildings and cities destroyed in the Second World War. It's certainly going to come up in our own generation as we try to rebuild from this horrible urban destruction that I began the lecture with. Giovannoni supported reconstruction when there is sufficient knowledge of the historic condition to ensure accuracy and when a community seeks restitution of its heritage and identity. Current conservation theory is skeptical, seeking to prevent production of a mere copy, or at worst, a fake. Seeking a balance between material authenticity and community values, Giovannoni defended the rebuilding using the Italian phrase that you see here under the underline, dove era, come era, where it was and how it was. This was the approach, for example, that happened when the very famous Campanile of San Marco Square fell in Venice in 1902. And the question became what to do about rebuilding it. It also occurred at the end of the war in this very famous case in Italy of the destruction of the medieval abbey of Monte Cassino, which has now been completely reconstructed, that Giovannoni himself began to be involved with just before his death. So I'm coming here to the end of my talk, and what I want you to do is to maybe consider these, try to remember, if you can, these kind of 4 lessons to take away. And they, to me, they provide not just these lessons, but the work on this book about this remarkable man gave me great inspiration, and I'm hoping that now that he's a little bit less forgotten by my sharing some of these ideas with you, that you can maybe think about some of his ideas and reflect on, as I said at the beginning, on how some of these ideas might relate to some of what you already know. I'm not really here to sell this book, but if you want to buy this book, it's published by Getty Publications, and for those of you who do want to buy it, the best way to do it is to go to this website, to this link, shop.getty.edu, search for the book, and then if you want to buy it and you want to check out with a 20% discount, you can use this code and agree to free shipping, and they'll send it to you for free. So not for free, not the book for free, but once you pay for the book, the shipping will be free. Anyway, I say that somewhat hesitantly because I'm not really here to sell the book. I'm really here to introduce you to these wonderfully inspirational ideas of this forgotten master that I'll be happy to talk to you about now. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Jeff. I certainly have some questions, and I'm sure other people do as well. And
Hi, Hi, my name is Deirdre Kennedy. I'm a first-year MRP student, and thank you for your talk. I have a lot of interest in climate impacts on urban spaces, and I'm curious.
In what?
Climate impacts,
Climate
and I
impact.
know you mentioned natural disasters and
Yes.
climate change overall, and I was wondering if you could just speak more to how that interplays with these 4 key lessons. I'm mostly thinking natural disasters, but also climate migration and like large-scale interventions in urban spaces to make them more resilient, and how that tension or balance could be. And yeah, thanks.
Well, Giovannoni himself was not, none of the people that I'm aware of in his generation really were thinking about what we call climate crisis today or climate change. However, he was one of the other things that he did in his life, and one of the reasons that he was so involved with these botanical metaphors, was that he was an avid hiker. And he began the first National Park Association in Italy. And he was very committed to what we would call natural areas or nature, as well as culture. And I guess the way I would answer your question is that I think because of these mutual interests he had in the built environment and the natural environment, if we can make that distinction, which I don't feel comfortable always making, but let's just, for the sake of argument, say that there's a built environment and a natural environment. He really sought the integration of those. And so in terms of the challenges of climate change, if he were here today, I think what he would be urging us to look at is incorporating nature into our cities and confronting the power of nature and the importance of nature, the significance of nature in urban settings. So he would probably be thrilled to hear about initiatives to plant more trees within urban settings, or to change the way that roofscapes are made to reflect the sun and use greater shading, natural shading. And so I think he would be among those people today that are urging for that kind of approach. I don't know what he would do, I don't know what I would do about answering the major challenges of what do we do about greenhouse gases and mitigating these major global forces that are affecting our climate change. But at the more micro level of placing nature within city, that's what he would be. That was something very important to him. I hope that answers what you were looking for.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Yifei Zhao, first year MRP. I spent my undergraduate years in Suzhou, a city with a rich historical heritage in China. Your speech reminded me of an urban renewal project I worked on last year in one of Suzhou's important historic districts. During the project, we met a common issue: the appearance of incongruous new structures within the traditional urban fabric. For example, a resident had added a modern glass balcony to the top of their house, disrupting the harmony of the surrounding buildings, which followed the traditional style of white walls and black roofs. Such alterations are often seen in that district, and our project aimed to address these challenges. I'm curious how Giovannoni's theories, such as innesto, might provide insights or solutions for these kinds of urban renewal conflicts in historic districts like Suzhou.
What a wonderful example. Thank you so much. 谢谢你 for sharing that with us. I I think you're absolutely right. I think that wood, not just, I think that, first of all, even though I've made this 6 separate themes, I think that one thought that comes to mind from your example is the way that these themes really overlap a great deal. And so in the case of Suzhou, where to make changes to a city like that has such a deep historic past, the notion of just adding arbitrarily a glass or metal structure to a traditional building is something that would definitely be contrary to the principles of innesto that he espoused. One of the things we tried to do in the book, and I'm assuming that Cornell is going to get a copy of this book. I don't know for sure, but I'm assuming that it'll be available to be consulted, and you're welcome to look at it afterward. But what we did was we clustered, so there are 30 different readings or writings by Giovannoni here, and we clustered them around these 6 themes. So in the case of innesto, you would have 4 or 5 essays that he wrote over the course of his life, where he talks about this in much greater detail than I could in this summary. But you're absolutely right. That Suzhou is an excellent example, and it's I'd love to talk to you about your project, because it's exactly the kind of setting that would relate to a lot of the issues that I talked about today. So thanks for sharing that.
Hey, Jeff, thank you for this wonderful talk. And for the students here, most of you are in my class. Jeff was one of my mentors when I was a student many years ago, and I'm here now in large measure because of this gentleman. I wanted to continue on part of what the young woman was asking you, and that is, given evolving building technologies, materials, construction techniques, I wonder what both Giovannoni and you feel about these additions that I call jewel case additions. I actually feel, when done well, add rather than detract from the historic architecture. I teach a class, well, most of you are in it, up in Baker Lab, and the physical sciences building was added to it with this, again, what I would term a kind of crystalline jewel box addition, and creating a magnificent arcade space in there. The same architects, Coder Kim, both Cornellians, did the Klarman edition behind Goldwin Smith, which I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, because if we are to add in a very disparate style, I think those are really good examples of how it can be done in a way that complements and even adds.
Thanks, Tom. I'm more familiar with the Goldwin Smith example than the Baker Lab, so I can't really, I confess I haven't been there, so I wouldn't be able to express any opinion about that. But I agree with you that in the case of Goldwin Smith, I think the addition was handled, frankly, much more sympathetically than Rem Koolhaas and his crew did here. And it's not that I'm trying to be trashing Milstein. I mean, there are many wonderful things that happen in this building. And there are some wonderful people teaching here and some wonderful students that spend most of their lives here. And it's wonderful that this exists for the sake of education. It's just that I'm just stunned by the lack of respect for the setting that this building exemplifies. Whereas, in contrast, I think that the addition, the Kleinman addition to Goldwin Smith links very successfully to the street behind it. It allows for I can remember before I was here, before there was the Kleinman addition, and it used to be, if you were going along the street behind this building, it was not that easy to get into Goldwin Smith and to figure out where you were going to go. Whereas now, I think that to me, that's a much more effective transition. And at least, even though, again, I'm not trying to urge for a strictly historicist solution. As you were saying, there's nothing wrong inherently, I don't think, and I don't think Giovannoni would think, with using new material. It's more how that material and how those forms either show a respect for, a love for the place. I mean, I'm reminded of, in this regard, of people like Dolores Hayden and the power of place and the importance of place as a notion to work with. And it just seems to me that there are examples like this Kleinman edition which shows that respect for the place, even though, we could debate on whether it's successful or not. But I think I think it's fairly successful because of that and the use of new material with the old. I can remember being here at a time when there were serious discussions going on about how to expand Olin Library. And the decision was made to dig that hole and to place the addition really underground in order not to deface this modernist structure on campus. So I think I think Cornell has some wonderful and some awful examples of this respect for setting.
Thanks for your presentation. My name is Jiayi Wang, first-year MRP student. My question is, how do you think Giovannoni will view the integration of modern technologies, such as AI and smart materials, into the rehabilitation of old buildings while maintaining historical integrity?
Very good question. I think he and frankly I am a bit scared by AI in this regard, because I think that effective urban design can't really be done by algorithm. I guess that's the simplest way for me to say it. I think that what he was about was, again, looking at the very first of these lessons. Whoops. Oh. Okay. The very first of these lessons having to do with direct observation. He thought it was extremely important to place architects and planners, to take all of you, as Tom was just saying he's done with your class, take you to an actual place and look at it and understand what the setting is. Where does it come from? Why does it look like the way it does? What is the setting around it? What is its true context? What is its intellectual context? Who was responsible for creating what already exists? These are the kinds of things which, maybe in this new world of AI, that sensitivity will somehow be addressed or inculcated or developed. But it seems to me, in the world of algorithms that we're all barraged with right now, it becomes formulaic, it becomes mathematical, it becomes a series of formula, and I think that is what goes against his approach, which is incrementally to make decisions. That's why I think he would also, I think he'd be pleased that a lot of his ideas found their way into urban, charters, and I could tell you all kinds of these charters and documents that they appear in. The Borough Charter, 1979, the Venice Charter. He himself was involved in the creation of one of the earliest of these urban charters called the Athens Charter in 1931. But I think he was very opposed to this idea of formula and charters determining everything. I think it was more direct observation, trying to create in students like you the sensitivity to the context, the sensitivity to the building, the love of the place, the concern for the people who are using that place, making sure, again, this integration of architecture with people, because he loved Rome, he loved Italy, he loved his own country, he loved his own neighborhoods. So if you, being Chinese, go back to China, he would urge you to, being Chinese, to take your inherent understanding of Chinese culture and work with that sensitively in a curatorial way to continue that perpetuation of Chinese culture as reflected in its cities, as opposed to the kinds of big buildings that happened for the 2008 Olympics in China, where architects from around the world were being brought in and vast areas of Beijing and other cities were being decimated in order to build these gigantic, weird urban forms. So that's the kind of thing that he would be tremendously upset about, and I'm upset about myself as an outsider. Anyway, as a Chinese person, that's what I think he would be urging you to do. So again, thank you for bringing that up.
We have a lot of people who want to.
Okay. I'll try to be briefer in my answers.
Thank you for your wonderful lecture. My name is Chris. You mentioned that Giovannoni's architectural conservation philosophy integrates sustainability and social justice. So my question is, how can architectural conservation and the regeneration projects promote social justice, especially in vulnerable communities? As we know, it means lack of money, lack of development, and lack of opportunity. So how can we balance the preservation of historical buildings with advancing social inclusion, economic opportunities, and cultural heritage? Yeah.
Wow, very big and important question. I guess I bring you back to these examples I showed in Rome, the Via dei Coronari, or the Salicoto region in Siena, the district in Siena. There are some other examples too, in Bergamo and Assisi, where the notion is that the reason it relates so much to social justice is that it comes down, I guess, to this word gentrification that we've created, this word gentrification. In other words, he was concerned, Giovannoni was concerned, and as occurred in Bologna, in actual fact, the idea was to, if there was a need to vacate people, residents from their place in order to upgrade the physical fabric, the importance was to bring those people back, or at least give them the chance to come back into the neighborhood. And there are other examples of this as well. I mean, this has been, I could give you some examples of this in places like Paris, where they also did this. But Bologna was a particularly good example, where, in other words, the importance was to have the architectural change be an improvement for the people, for the neighborhood. Not necessarily for the investors, not necessarily for building a profit, not necessarily for making this area higher, getting more taxes for the community. Instead, the criteria was doing something for the people. And ideally, this is where heritage conservation should be going. All too often, in my opinion, in my field, when these changes are made, when positive changes are made, they do become more expensive, and people are displaced, and the notion of social justice is lost. But ideally, heritage conservation, historic preservation, should be about making improvements sometimes historic preservation is called the management of change. In Giovannoni's case, it was really the management of continuity and trying to make sure that you were making incremental changes that were perpetuating the culture and the inherent quality of the place. I hope that addresses your question. Thank you.
I just wanted to point out the two notes on the screen. One is a thank you for your contribution in helping to save Henry Killam Murphy's estate on Long Island. And the second is Professor Oxhorn's link to how OMA defended the design of this building in terms of the Secretary of the Interior standards, which I've mentioned is a great debate for our preservation classes as well.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My name is Maureen. I am a staff member here at CRP. You wrote on one of the slides that Giovannoni had overcome the 19th century divide between Viollet-le-Duc's stylistic approach and the romantic untouchability of ruins that Ruskin writes about. I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on that.
Thank you. Yeah. Without getting into too much detail, because maybe not everybody here knows about this, but in the late 19th century, there was quite an active preservation, conservation debate about whether to go in the direction of Viollet-le-Duc and use Gothic architecture in particular as an inspiration for new design, and therefore many, for those of you who don't know, many of the cathedrals in France, many major ecclesiastical buildings, in fact, entire cities in southwestern France were rebuilt according to these principles of basically copying the forms from previous periods with new design. Ruskin was totally opposed to that kind of approach. And in his writings about the Stones of Venice and other of his writings, he was much more in the kind of, how would you put it, I guess, freezing the site without making that intervention, paying attention to the existing fabric of the site and not making that change. And this led to two very divergent opinions. And what Giovannoni was doing was trying to, he wasn't consciously trying to pull one or the other into the center, but through his own approach, he was much more interested in sort of, in a transactional way, taking some things from Viollet-le-Duc and some things from Ruskin. In other words, paying a great deal of respect for the exact, for what was already existing. But if you were going to make a change to it, as he did, and as I showed you with that example of the Arch of Titus, which was not his example, but that was something he thought was a wonderful example of making the change, but making sure that you could see the difference. If we could magically transport ourselves in front of Notre Dame Cathedral right now, my suspicion is we would have a very hard time seeing what was new and what was old, because we're so used to seeing it in that one way that Viollet-le-Duc redid the facade, as he did with many other buildings. And he saved them in order, I mean, in that sense, the good news is that he saved them. But Giovannoni was really looking at, so he was deriving inspiration from both Ruskin and Viollet-le-Duc, and in his own practice, he wasn't consciously trying to say one was better than the other. He just was kind of going a middle route.
Thank you for your presentation today. And my name is Zitoma, first year MRP student. And I want to know, during the actual projects of urban development and category preservation, is there a clear framework for evaluating which building to be preserved or which building to be demolished? And also, how can we make sure the new building can coexist with with the old one in building facade and urban fabric. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So you're really asking two questions, I think. One about the criteria. I can't give you a specific answer to precisely what criteria he used, but I do know that he was, first of all, one of the major criteria. Think of it as your teeth. You know, maybe let's use this dental metaphor. The idea being that building by building, a team of surveyors would go look at the structure. Is this a safe building? Is it going to fall down? Is it going to harm people who are going to live there, or is it already harming people who are living there in a structural, physical sense? So certainly the physical structure, the engineering nature of the building would certainly be part of the criteria. It would also be important to look at what contribution does that individual building make to its setting, to its ambiente. Is it a key sort of heavy building in terms of its cultural weight, so to speak, or is it simply one of many other buildings that if it was taken out, if we took out the tooth, you know, what do we do once we take that tooth out? Do we put a dental implant in? Do we put a bridge in our teeth? Do we just leave it out and make a little piazza out of it? So these are the kinds of things, but the important thing is to look building by building to see the relationship between the individual structure and its composite setting. Your second question, sorry, let me think now, what were you saying about, can you remind me again,
How to make the new building exhaust with the old one in a building?
it's an important, very important question, but it becomes difficult to give a general answer to that. It really depends on the individual case. Tom Campanella just was mentioning these two examples here on campus. You know, it would be important to actually go there, look at it, and then be able to say, oh, this was a pretty good decision, and this was not a very good decision. But it would be difficult to give you a general answer, except that probably the massing of the building, the scale of the new versus the old is something that certainly Giovannoni would want to modulate the difference between low-rise and high-rise. That's why I think he'd be fairly appalled by the new convention center on Green Street because of the way that it seems to pay no attention to the scale of buildings and the setting around it. It's just taking its own importance as opposed to situating itself within an existing cultural context.
Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Ted Lim. I am a second-year MRP student from South Korea. I just had a question. So I know there are a lot of regulations and restrictions on building small buildings these days, and I think it's an environment really to promote the environment that promotes developers to build larger scale buildings financially. So I'm wondering what would be a practical approach or like first step and next step to promote this like historic integration of new buildings into old city in the existing urban fabric.
Thank you very much. You're absolutely right. I think that, you know, one of the problems with the way that let's say urban development has evolved, not just in our country, but in many parts of the world, certainly in the neoliberal era that may be coming to a close, I don't know. It seems to me that what has been lacking on the part of planners, and it's true, it seems to me here in Ithaca as well as elsewhere, is an inability or a refusal to take on the very thorny issue of aesthetics. I use that word somewhat haltingly because my aesthetic judgment is probably not your aesthetic judgment. And if we ask people here about their aesthetics, even about this building, as Jeff was saying, I'm sure there's a lot of debate about this. Some people really like it, some people don't like it, in terms of the beauty of the building or the beauty of the place. But it seems to me that by reducing, this is why I stress in Giovannoni's approach the importance of seeing the city as a living organism, as opposed to simply a series of buildings. In other words, I suppose it's the difference, I would put it, is the difference in architectural design between a good architectural design and just designing more square meters. If you're just designing more square meters, if that's really what you're learning, then you don't have to come to a place like Cornell to do that. You can do that, you can find anywhere, and you'll figure out how to make more square meters, higher buildings, bigger buildings, using more concrete, more steel, whatever. But that's not why you're here, I hope. All of you. It's instead to learn to be more sensitive, to be more, to have your designs, your solutions be something that makes for social betterment, that makes a better place. And so coming back to your important point is that all too often, it seems to me, we deal with the plot, we deal with the site as a place bounded legally by 40 feet by 100 feet or something like that in the standard lot size in Ithaca for residential buildings. And we allow, so long as, according to certain regulations or certain gross floor area or what a lot of the world calls plot ratio, just allow, whatever the regulations allow, we'll just build to that. And that seems to be a terrible way of making a decision. Instead of doing what Giovannoni did, which is to look again at the setting, so what's going to happen when this new gigantic thing is put into that setting? What are the implications of it for the people and for the place? So I don't know, I'm hoping that addresses your question, but that's the way I see it anyway.
Jeff, I'm going to introduce a question from Professor Mary Woods, but I'm going to be a little bit provocative in doing so because I think her question is as well. There's continuity, but the continuity of Rome was not built so much incrementally. It was built by emperors who had no problem doing whatever they wanted, and as did Mussolini, as did a lot of people. So we always have this kind of historical paradox that the cities we want to save didn't follow those rules when they became the cities we want to save. The convention center, for instance, is not just that, but it's also housing for the homeless and much needed housing in the city. And of course, Mary talks about the introduction of a train station as a kind of urbanistic necessity. So I'm not trying to set you up as someone who is against all change, but rather to understand how one responds to change, I guess, within Giovannoni and how he could appreciate bigger change than just some of the delicate additions we've seen before.
Well, I think it's a really important point, Jeff. Thank you. And I think the Michelucci Florence station is a very good example of this, where the insertion of new fabric or new infrastructure into the city is not something that Giovannoni, opposed uniformly, and it's certainly not something that I oppose uniformly. I think it's exceedingly important here in Ithaca that the unhoused are given an effective place to live. I just don't know that awful structure, what I consider that awful structure on Route 13, which is one of the buildings that was built for housing the unhoused, is the solution. And I don't think he would have been pleased with that as a solution either. But I think that, he and frankly I, I'm certainly not, the notion is not to freeze the city in a certain state so that it can't accommodate tram lines or buses or automobiles in the case of Giovannoni. One of his best examples in Rome, I'll just give another Roman example, is that there was a great deal of pressure, as I mentioned about Piazza Navona, there was a great deal of pressure because the notion was, let's put a highway right through Piazza Navona. Let's just take out those Bernini fountains and just, what a perfect place for a road. And what he did was he said, no, well, yeah, we need a new road. Yes, we need a new road. So he built the road, he designed the road that's called the Corso di Rinascimento between the Pantheon and Piazza Navona, that long, effective thoroughfare. And he was responsible for designing that. And they built new buildings that, in a more historicist mode, granted, but that's all new construction along that road, and older structures had to be taken out. But it was done because of the needs of the time. We need absolutely to deal with some of this automobile traffic, and that's how the Corso was created near the Piazza Argentina, and it's just that he was very opposed to the way that Haussmann had dealt with this in Paris, where the idea was to create large axes in the way, for example, from the Louvre to the Opéra in Paris, having just this broad axis with these two monuments on either end of the axis. Because there were proposals to do that in Rome too, to take the Corso and make it a completely straight line. And he said, no, these other buildings are incredibly important, but we can take out some of it, but let's make sure that it's curving so that we can keep some of these important key buildings. So that's just another example of where he was being very transactional in accommodating some of the needs for the automobile, for buses, for trams, for new infrastructure, but at the same time, not obliterating what was already existing.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Yumi Mizumori. I'm a first-year MRP student. Giovannoni emphasized the importance of respecting the local culture and the environment. However, in today's context, globalized and standardized architecture style is dominate many historical cities. How can we maintain local architecture identified in the face of globalization, and are there any successful examples we can learn from them?
Yeah, that's again a very good question. What comes to mind as an answer to that question is a project that Jean Nouvel, the French architect, did in New Caledonia. There was a call in New Caledonia for this Pacific island colony of France. And the indigenous people there was a proposal to have a cultural center for promoting indigenous culture within that Pacific nation. And the idea was to bring in a good architect to deal with that. And Jean Nouvel, the French architect, went there, and one thing that impressed me about this project was he spent a great deal of time just talking, listening to the indigenous people from the island about what they needed in this center, what they wanted. He studied the vernacular architecture, the bamboo and the other architecture of these indigenous people, and he came up with this quite amazing project. I think it's called the Jibao Cultural Center in New Caledonia. And to me, that's one of the most inspiring examples of what you just said, where there was a need, and in a standard, if they were doing it in a standard way, they just would bring in any old architect and build a cultural center as if the cultural center was being built in Ithaca or in Japan or in Korea or in China. Whereas because of Jean Nouvel's sensitivity to local culture and to the importance of local culture, he instead spent a lot of time listening. And that's, I guess, the answer to your question, it seems to me, is that you need the combination of a highly competent design architect, but somebody who is sensitive to the importance of local culture, local context, and what Giovannoni called the continuity of culture. So again, it's difficult to give you a standard answer, a general answer, except that it would seem to me the important thing to do would be to seek out, and there are many of them, wonderful architects that have that sensitivity inherently in how they approach design.
So I know a lot of you still have questions, which is great, but we've come to 2 o'clock. So let's thank our speaker again for a great presentation and for leaving us with all of these provocative questions. And remember, there is the talkback, and you're welcome to join us in 105 if you want to ask those questions you didn't get a chance to do now.